today's lesson we're going to learn about exposures. So exposures is all to do with trying to create the right balanced image. So if you allow more light to come into the camera and your image appears quite light, then that can be called overexposed. It means the detail's been blown out. So when it's too light, when it's had too much light, then it will become white or washed out. Then if you go to the opposite end, if you haven't exposed your camera, your image for long enough, then you will have an underexposed image. An underexposed image means it will be too dark. So it's about fine tuning. But your camera will very often just go for the 0 mark and get what it considers to be the best exposure. But if you're shooting on manual, then you can decide, and I tend to always underexpose my images. I love to get the tonal details in the skin, I love to get the tonal details in the sky, all of those things. So for me, I think it's better to have more detail. So if your picture's slightly darker, then you can always make it lighter. But if it's already too light, then you can't get that information back because it's not been recorded. But you need to again think about the type of pictures that you want to take. I mean, some photographers like the overexposed look. I know a lot of fashion photographers use that style within their work. Landscape photographers doing sunsets, they would deliberately underexpose so that you get all lovely details in the sky. So that's exposure. So please have a look through the PowerPoint, and then that will take you through exactly what it looks like when it's overexposed and when it's underexposed. Thank you. So what is exposure? So the definition of exposure is, firstly, we call it exposure when we take a photo. So it's in the act of making or taking a photo. But it's the balance between the aperture, shutter speed and the ISO setting. And it's about creating a good balance between the three, creating that triangle to get a satisfactory image, a good exposure, a good quality image. So just to remind ourselves again, the more light, the brighter the image. And we use the term overexposed. And if it has less light, the darker the image will be, and we use the term underexposed because it hasn't had enough light, not enough exposure to light. So when you are using the internal light meter of your camera, this is where you see it on the camera, okay? You'll either see it on the top here, or you'll see it when you look through the viewfinder as well. So I've got my camera set on manual, which means then I decide on the exposure settings. And you can see here, you've got the minus, the 0 and the plus. So the minus indicates it will be underexposed. And then you've got fractions, brackets here. So that's a third, 2/3, and then that's like a stop darker. Okay, so here it's set a stop darker. 0 is what the camera normally refers to as its ideal exposure. But I find often the camera will just basically, the exposure choice might be a little bit too light. It doesn't always have as much depth to the images. And over on this side we've got the plus, and the plus here indicates it will be overexposed, so it will be too bright. So how do you change the exposure on your camera? Well, the first thing you need to do, if you want to have full control of the aperture and the shutter speed and the ISO, then you set your camera on M for manual, okay? I tend to just use M for manual. I certainly don't use any of these settings, and auto, no, we don't need auto. That's allowing the camera to dictate everything. So manual gives you full creative license to take the images that you want to take. So to change the exposure, Remember, we've got the dial here. Now, if you just turn the dial, that will change the shutter speed alone. But if you want to change the aperture, you need to press in the plus and minus button here and then turn the dial, and that will change the aperture. So remember, the shutter is to do with how long the shutter is open, so that's to do with time, and the aperture is to do with how big the hole is, and it acts like the iris of the eye. Okay, so the bigger the hole, the more light. The smaller the hole, the less light. The longer the time is open for the shutter, the more light that comes in. The shorter the time, the less light. So here I've just wanted to give you some examples of what an overexposed image would look like, but also to refer to the shutter speed as well. So if we look here on the back of my camera, the aperture here is at 1.8. We can see that's really shallow depth of field and just focused on the foreground. The fences in the background is completely blurry, okay? So it's on 1.8. And then the shutter speed is at 320th of a second, okay? Now the zeros here and the plus symbols this way, and that is one stop too bright, okay? So that's, you can see here, the colours, they look really milky, it looks washed out. So overexposed is always going to be at the plus symbol, and this is +1. So the next image, we've still got the aperture at 1.8, but the exposure time is half. Now originally the last one, if we go back, was 320. This exposure time is half. So it's half the amount of light. So it's 640. Now this is what the camera recommends as the best setting, okay? So you can see there's a lot more colour there. And the exposure generally is still pretty good. However, I still think it looks a little bit light, a bit washed out. Having seen this lovely delphinium plant in my garden, it's not really doing it justice. So if we go to the next one, here we go. Now this is what we call underexposed. So if we look here on the light meter, we've got the 0 and then it's gone one stop minus. So the exposure time is now been halved again, so it's less light is coming in, therefore the picture will appear darker. And you can see now the flowers have got much more depth to them. It may be possibly a little bit darker, but remember you can change it, these settings, as little notches, so it doesn't have to be a whole stop bracket that you will make it lighter or darker. It could be a third of a stop, okay, or 2/3. So there's a lot of freedom to what you can do. So the definition, so just to recap, definition: overexposed means there's too much light and the photo will appear too bright, and underexposed means there's not enough light, so the photo appears too dark. So exposure is all about thinking about what you want to emphasize, and you can use that internal light meter to indicate when you want to make your picture just that little bit darker. If you want to do that with your sunsets, you want to get those lovely rich coloured tones in, or if you want to get that sort of bleached portrait with the sun glaring, then you would slightly overexpose the pictures.